Welcome to this, the third in a series of presentations on the e-learning platform of the Ultimate Implant Year Course, and that e-learning platform is of course smiletube.tv. In the second presentation we looked at getting started as an enrolled student on the Ultimate Implant Year programme, and you were shown how to log into the site, to access the list of icons and to access the learning material and the learning support tools. You will recall the icon entitled Learning Paths, and by clicking on that Learning Paths icon you had access to a list of presentations. To begin any of those presentations you simply left mouse click on the presentation title. And to show you how we do bring learning to life on smiletube.tv, we're going to sample the anatomy presentation. This is the opening screen of that presentation, and before we start, let's just have a look around at some of the details available on the screen. For example, here we can see that this is the Ultimate Implant Year Course Anatomy version 2 presentation. And we haven't started rolling yet, so we are 0 seconds into what is a 32-minute and 8-second presentation. To the right of this, we have an attachments icon, and frequently learning resource material will be attached to the presentations. And by clicking here, you may find a paper or an article that you can download and read alongside the presentation. So that is some of the learning support material that is available through the SmileTube website. Now we can see who the presenter is. Here is a small thumbnail image of, in this case, Dr. Ken Nicholson. If you want to find out a little more about the presenter, click on the bio icon and a brief resume of the presenter's biography appears. Click on that again, the window disappears, and we have an email icon as well. The reason for that is to allow you to communicate directly with the presenter. Why might you do that? Well, let's say for example on slide 3 the presenter said something that you weren't quite sure about. By clicking on the email icon you can send a query directly to that presenter and ask for clarification. So let's get rid of that little window again by clicking the email icon once more. And now below this you can see we have an outline list of the slides in this presentation, and we can scroll down through that list of slides. We can look at a thumbnail view of those slides, i.e. look at the images of the slides, and again you can scroll down through those. We have notes that are relating to the slides, and finally we have a search button. Let's see how the search button works. This, after all, is an anatomy presentation, so you might be interested, for example, in the lingual artery. And if we type in lingual artery and click on the arrow key, we can see that in slide number 28, the title of which is the mandible, there is something about the lingual artery, and in slide number 34, again, the contents include the lingual artery. So let's go back to the thumbnails view and now start the presentation. And to do so, we use the play button, which when we press play will become a pause button, and we also have a forward button and a back button. And just before we do actually launch the presentation properly, other features, this icon allows you to change the size of the screen, and clicking again brings us back to the original format. And here we have a little speaker icon, and you can adjust the volume of the presentation using this slider scale. So let's start the presentation by clicking on the play button, and you will hear the narration. Welcome to the Ultimate Implant Year Course presentation on anatomy. Now I've just pressed the pause button again, and as you can see we have vision or visual presentation, and we have auditory presentation. As you can see from this diagram, the anatomy of the head and neck is extremely complicated. However, as was alluded to in the opening title of the presentation, we will restrict ourselves to anatomy relevant to implant dentistry. And don't worry, we're not going to ask questions just yet. Now I've just pressed the pause
One of the
again,
main...
But a statement was made there, and don't worry, we're not going to ask questions just yet. And that is so important, and I alluded to this in the second presentation. Think about the lecture theatre scenario again, where some lecturer points to you and asks a question. And as I've said previously, you shrivel up in your seat and think, oh my goodness, why did he or why did she ask me? Whereas in the safety of your own environment, the comfort of your own surgery, home, office, wherever, and learning at your own pace, you're more likely to have a stab at answering these questions when they're presented to you in this format, and that in itself enhances your learning experience. Let's listen to a little more of the narration.
Main things that I want you to take away from this presentation is that resorption changes anatomy. Look at this clinical photograph. You have seen it before in the introduction to implant dentistry. What has happened here? The alveolar process has resorbed, and that has all sorts of a knock-on effect in terms of our case assessment and treatment planning. Where once we had a class 1 incisal relationship in the dentate situation, in the edentulous situation we now have a skeletal class 3 relationship and a hugely increased vertical dimension to restore. So, don't forget, resorption changes anatomy. Not only in a case like this does this greatly affect our restorative procedures, but also think about flap design. This will even make a difference in where we place our incisions. Let's spend a couple of minutes in the next slide looking at the structure of the skull.
So again, I've pressed the pause button, and this icon in the thumbnails view indicates that this is a video slide. Let's scroll further down through the slides and find some of the engaging interactive slides. Here, for example, is one. And there is a clue here. This is a slide entitled The Paranasal Sinuses, and in the introduction we are giving details on how to actually use this interactive slide. Identify the marked region, click on the marker to find the correct answer. So you're looking at this and thinking, this is one of the paranasal sinuses, what might it be? Could this be the ethmoidal sinus, the sphenoidal sinus, perhaps the frontal sinus? And again, in the safety of your own environment, you're more likely to have a go at answering such questions. And again, I reiterate that this enhances your learning experience. So let's find out what paranasal sinus this actually is. What do you think? Yes, it's the frontal sinus. What might this be? Click on the icon to find the correct answer. The ethmoidal sinus. And this? Again, what do you think? Sphenoidal sinus. Finally, and you'll notice on the black paranasal sinuses menu bar at the top, when we click on this, something happens there. Next slide appears. And only when you have answered...
So, now that we know where...
Only when you have answered all questions on the interactive slides can you proceed to the following slide. And again, let's click on the play button to listen to the narration as it continues.
Where it is and its relationship to the sphenoidal, ethmoidal and frontal sinuses, let's consider the maxillary sinus in a little more detail. First of all, this is the infraorbital foramen.
So again, I've pressed the pause button. Let's move a little further on and find some more interactive slides. But actually, before I do that, let's consider this.
The whole objective is to make the subject relevant to our clinical implant dentistry. Here we have a clinical photograph taken during sinus augmentation using the lateral window technique. Now, with your underlying knowledge of the anatomy of the maxillary sinus, when we get around to discussing such techniques, and indeed the complications of such techniques, you'll have a much better understanding of the whole procedure. The next slide gives us a few more details and facts on the maxillary sinus. Hopefully you will have noticed from one of the earlier slides that the maxillary sinus is the largest of the paranasal sinuses.
And again, I've just pressed pause. So let's scroll further down through this presentation. Now we're moving on to the mandible.
In this specimen, I have cut a window in the lateral wall of the body of the mandible, and you can clearly see the thick cortical bone and the underlying lamellar bone. As implant practitioners, this is something that we are greatly interested in terms of bone quality. You will be hearing a lot more about bone quality in subsequent presentations. However, at this stage it is suffice to know that the bone...
So hopefully you can see A, how SmileTube.tv brings learning to life, but B, also how the presentations are made relevant to our clinical implant dentistry. Again, scrolling a little further down through the presentation, let's find another interactive slide. And here we're considering the floor of the mouth, and the instructions are: test your knowledge, identify the marked features, click on the markers to find the correct answer. Name this muscle. What do you think this muscle is? Yes, orbicularis oris. And as previously, you've got to complete all the questions before you can move to the next slide.
I'm sure you didn't find the previous slide too troublesome. However, let's add a little more detail to the picture. Branching off the common carotid artery, we have the facial artery, the lingual artery, the sublingual artery, and we must also consider the inferior alveolar artery.
And so we're building our knowledge of anatomy. And again, we tie all of our presentations to relevant evidence, to relevant articles and papers. Here, for example,
although extremely rare, life-threatening hemorrhage in the floor of the mouth as a result of implant placement is a possibility.
And in today's evidence-based dentistry, this is extremely important. And again, the Ultimate Implant Year course has been built around evidence-based practice. So as you can see, these slides relate to the mandible, and here we have another interactive slide. But let's move down to some of the progress assessment. In this case, as I mentioned in the second presentation, formative assessment. And the formative assessment on this presentation begins with:
let's have some fun. During the next few slides you have the opportunity to test your powers of recollection. And don't forget, one of the wonderful things about this method, e-learning method of teaching and learning, is that you can go back to the previous slides time and time again. You can come back to this presentation for the year that you're involved with the course as many times as you like, and each time you do so it enhances your learning experience. So have a look at the next few slides, and as I say, have some fun.
So again, anatomy interaction 1. The instructions are in front of us. Test your knowledge of anatomy. Can you identify the labelled features? Click to reveal the answer. What artery is this? Axillary artery. What artery and vein are these? Posterior superior alveolar artery and vein. What nerve is this? What nerve is this? And again, having answered all these questions, we can now move to the next slide. And in this case, what are the lines pointing to? And this is taken from one of the slides presented earlier in the presentation. So the answers to these questions are contained within the presentation. And this is formative assessment. And again, in the comfort of your own environment, at your own pace, you can go through these presentations and build your knowledge of whatever the presentation is working on, whether it be anatomy, implant design, abutment design, cysts of the jaws, so many topics. And as was pointed out in the first of this series of presentations, you can find details of the Ultimate Implant Year course content on the homepage of SmileTube.tv. In a subsequent presentation, we will finally look at module assessment and how your grades are acquired and accumulated and recorded during the year of the Ultimate Implant Year course.